Caleb Mercer wasn't walking into a church. He was walking into a trap. Every creak of the floorboards under his boots sounded like a countdown to a life he didn't want. The air inside was thick with the mingled scents of dust and pine oil, but it wasn't enough to cover the stench of pity and judgment from the gathered townsfolk. Faces turned as he took his place at the altar, their eyes flicking between him and the empty aisle, already savoring the story they'd repeat for years. If you're a true Wild West soul, drop a big yes in the comments. Let's see who's still riding the trail with us. In the front pew, Elias Ward, his stepfather, his jailer in all but name, sat with his cane across his knees, his gaze as cold and immovable as stone. This marriage would happen. The debts were too deep, the homestead too important, and Caleb's pride wasn't worth a dime to anyone but himself. Prudence Whitlock was his way out, whether he wanted her or not. The church doors groaned open. Conversation died instantly. Prue stepped inside, and the first thing Caleb noticed was that she did not hesitate. She moved down the aisle with a steady, unhurried pace, her plain blue dress whispering against the wooden floor. She wasn't beautiful, not in the way Caleb had imagined for his bride, but there was a strength in the set of her shoulders, a quiet defiance in the way she carried herself. Her eyes found his, and he braced for shyness or submission. Instead, what stared back at him was a calm, unflinching challenge, as if she already knew the measure of the man she was marrying. The preacher began the vows, but Caleb heard none of it until his name was spoken. "I do," he said, his voice flat, almost mechanical. When her turn came, Prue's voice cut through the hush like a blade. "I do." No tremor, no hesitation, and there was something in the way she said it, not acceptance, but a promise or a warning. They turned to face the crowd. The whispers began immediately. Caleb felt the burn of every smirk, every sideways glance, but Prue's back stayed straight, her grip on his arm firm. The moment they stepped outside, the autumn air hit him sharp and cold, but it didn't clear his head. She climbed into the wagon without a word, folding her hands neatly in her lap. He climbed up beside her, telling himself this was business, nothing more. But as the wheels began to turn and the silence between them stretched heavy, Caleb realized with a chill that whatever this marriage was, it wasn't going to play out on his terms. The wagon wheels groaned over the rutted road, each jolt rattling Caleb's teeth and his temper. The silence between them was thick, almost deliberate. He kept his eyes fixed ahead, telling himself he didn't care what his new wife thought, that the ride to the Mercer homestead was nothing more than a formality before they went their separate ways under the same roof. "I suppose you'll want to see the house," he said finally, the word sharper than he intended. "I've already seen it," Prue replied without turning her head. "3 times, in fact, while you were in town, drinking your evenings away." His hands tightened on the reins until the leather bit into his palms. "I don't know what you think I think you've been pretending you're the only one who knows the shape of this place's troubles," she cut in. "But I know about the debts, the ones with the bank, the ones with the grain supplier, and the ones Elias hasn't told you about. Debts owed to men who don't write things down." Caleb's pulse kicked hard. "You're guessing." Her gaze slid to him, cool and steady. "I'm not. I also know your ranch hands have been skimming cattle sales for months, and your foreman's been the one making sure they get away with it." He blinked at her, the road blurring in front of him. "That's a lie. They've been with us for years." "Loyalty doesn't fill empty bellies," she said. "Desperate men take what they can, and Wade McClary has been taking plenty. Elias knows, but he can't fire him without the whole crew walking out." The wagon lurched over a deep rut, but Caleb barely felt it. He was staring at the land rolling out ahead of them, suddenly seeing it with different eyes, the sagging fences, the thinning herd, the outbuildings in disrepair. He'd blamed Elias's poor management, maybe even bad luck. But this was rot running deeper than he'd dared to imagine. "How do you know all this?" he asked finally, his voice low. Prue folded her hands in her lap. "Because I've been preparing for this marriage longer than you have. My father didn't just arrange it for the land rights, Caleb. Your homestead sits on the key to controlling water for 3 counties. But someone had to be smart enough to keep it from slipping through their fingers." Her eyes locked on his, unblinking. "The question is whether you're smart enough to listen or too proud to save what's yours." Caleb turned back to the road, but the image of her calm, calculating gaze burned in his mind. He'd thought he was marrying a burden. Instead, he'd brought a storm into his house, and it was already tearing through everything he thought he knew. Caleb had barely stepped into the study when the air shifted. Prue sat behind Elias's massive oak desk as if she'd been born to command it. Papers and ledgers fanned out before her like weapons. Across from her stood Silas Bragg, the foreman Caleb had trusted since boyhood, now looking pale and cornered, sweat beading along his temple. "What's going on here?" Caleb demanded. But Silas's eyes darted to him, then back to Prue, as if Caleb's presence meant little. "She knows," Silas muttered, voice tight. "Of course I know," Prue said evenly, not glancing up from the ledger. "You've been selling 15 head a month and reporting 10, pocketing the difference. I have every sale documented, every buyer named, every lie you've told since spring." Caleb's stomach knotted. "Silas, tell me this isn't true." Silas's shoulders sagged. "The ranch was sinking anyway. I've got a family to feed." "You had a job," Prue cut in, her voice sharp enough to slice through the room. "Now you have a choice. Return the money or meet the sheriff before sunrise." Silas's jaw tightened. "You think you can march in here and give orders? You're just a fat woman whose daddy paid someone to take her." Caleb froze. He expected her to flinch, to let the words sting. Instead, Prue rose slowly, her movements deliberate. "Mr. Bragg," she said softly, "your first mistake was thinking my size reflects my strength. Your second was assuming I came here alone." The floorboards creaked, and Caleb turned just as the front door opened. 3 men stepped inside, strangers with eyes like sharpened steel and holstered guns that hung low and ready. They moved without a word, spreading out like a tide claiming the shore. Silas's face drained of color. Who are they?" "The kind that ensures people keep their word," Prue replied. Silas's bluster broke. "The money's in my cabin, most of it. I spent some on medicine for my boy." "How much?" Prue asked. $40. "You'll return the rest and consider the 40 your severance pay," she said, then nodded toward the largest man, a broad-shouldered brute with a jagged scar across his jaw. "Hank will see you to it. You'll be gone by morning." As Silas shuffled out, Caleb's pulse still thundered in his ears. He looked at Prue, standing where Elias had once ruled, 3 armed strangers answering to her without hesitation. "Who are these men?" he asked, his voice rough. Prue met his gaze, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "The only thing keeping you alive right now, Mr. Mercer." The last light of day bled across the horizon when Caleb found Prue alone on the porch, her gaze fixed on the fading sun. The 3 strangers, her protection, were nowhere in sight, though he could feel their presence like wolves circling just out of view. "You owe me an explanation," he said, stepping into the cool evening air. She didn't look at him. "No, Caleb, I owe you the truth, and you may not like it." He folded his arms. "Start talking." Prue's fingers traced the porch railing, slow and deliberate. "My father wasn't just a landowner. He was a deal maker. The kind who could walk into a saloon with a debt and leave with half the county owing him favors. He taught me numbers before I could read, taught me leverage before I knew the meaning of the word love. She turned then, her eyes sharp in the dim light. And he wasn't picky about who he dealt with. Caleb's jaw tensed. What does that mean? It means I grew up in rooms where decisions were made with whiskey and gunpowder, where a handshake could seal your fortune or your coffin. She stepped closer, voice dropping low. Half the men I knew before I was 16 are either rich or buried in unmarked graves. The three you met today, Hank, Luke, and Mara, they're not ranch hands. They're what's left of my father's network. People who owe me their lives. People who collect debts, one way or another. Caleb stared at her, the pieces clicking together in his mind. So you've been around criminals your whole life. Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Criminals? Politicians? Out here there's not much difference. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because you would have looked at me the way you're looking at me now, she said, her tone flat. Like you're not sure if you should thank me or run. The boards under Caleb's boots creaked as he shifted his weight. Why marry me then? Why not just take the land by force, if you're this connected? Prue's gaze didn't waver. Because taking something doesn't mean you can hold it. You need the law on your side. Marriage gives me that, gives us that. Us? He asked, bitterness creeping into his voice. You think I'm here just to save your ranch? She shook her head slowly. I'm here because the people circling us won't hesitate to kill for those water rights. My father taught me that survival isn't about who owns the land, it's about who can keep it. The wind caught her hair, and for a moment, Caleb saw her not as the bride he'd been forced to marry, but as someone forged in fire and shadow, a woman who had already played the kind of game he didn't yet understand, and he realized with a cold twist in his gut, he was already a piece on her board. The night was too still. No coyotes called from the hills, no wind whispered through the grass, just the heavy, waiting silence that made the hair on Caleb's neck stand up. He found Prue in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a lantern burning low, her hands wrapped around a cup of untouched coffee. He's here, she said without looking up. Caleb froze in the doorway. Who? Jasper Vane. She spoke the name like it was poison. Rides into town tonight, stays at the Whitford Hotel. By morning, he'll be sniffing around our land like a wolf at the door. Caleb stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath his boots. You make him sound like the devil himself. He's worse. Prue's eyes lifted to his, sharp and unblinking. The devil makes promises. Vane just takes. He's made a fortune buying desperate men out of their land, and when they won't sell, she let the sentence hang, the weight of it heavier than the air between them. Caleb's jaw tightened. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying Jasper Vane has a way of making problems disappear. Ranchers fall off their horses, barns burn in the night, wells get poisoned, no proof, no witnesses. Just bad luck until you start counting how many of his enemies are buried in shallow graves. A muscle worked in Caleb's cheek. And he wants our water rights. Prue nodded. Wants them bad enough to kill for them. My father dealt with him once, one time too many. I was a girl, but I remember the look in Vane's eyes when he didn't get what he wanted. Cold, patient, like a snake coiled in the grass, waiting for the right moment to strike. Caleb pulled out a chair, sitting across from her. If he's as dangerous as you say, why not tell the sheriff? Prue's laugh was low and humorless. The sheriff owes Vane more than he earns in a year. Half the town does. Money like his doesn't just buy land, it buys silence. She leaned forward, voice dropping. The moment he steps foot on this ranch, he'll know where our weaknesses are. And right now, you're the biggest one. His brows drew together. What's that supposed to mean? It means you still think this is about running cattle and mending fences. It's not. This is about survival. Vane doesn't fight fair. And if you try to play this straight, you'll lose everything before you even realize the game started." Caleb felt the air thicken around them. Outside, the silence seemed to press closer, like even the night was listening. "So, what do we do?" he asked finally. Prue leaned back, her eyes shadowed in the lantern glow. "We make sure the snake strikes at air, and when he does, we cut off the head." Somewhere in the dark beyond the ranch, a single horse's hoofbeats echoed faintly, slow and deliberate, drawing closer. Caleb found them in the barn before dawn, shadows moving among the stalls like they belonged there. Corwin Hawk Hale leaned against a post, tall and wiry, his eyes the color of a storm about to break. Morgan Fitch sat on an upturned crate, cleaning a revolver with the precision of a man who'd taken more lives than he'd saved. Bram O'Connell loomed in the corner, a wall of muscle with hands like sledgehammers and a face carved from stone. "You're awake early, Mercer," Hawk said, his voice low and edged with dry amusement. "Or did Prue send you to measure the men guarding your land?" "I don't recall hiring anyone," Caleb replied, keeping his tone even though his gut tightened. "You didn't?" Hawk's gaze flicked toward the loft, where the faintest sound of Prue's boots could be heard descending the ladder. "We're here for her." Prue stepped into the light, her hair pulled back, her expression unreadable. "Meet the men who'll keep you breathing, Caleb. Hawk, Morgan, Bram. They were my uncle's men back when he wore a badge in places the law had all but given up on." Morgan gave a thin smile. "We're not law anymore. We solve problems the law won't touch." "And you expect me to just let 3 armed strangers roam my land?" Caleb asked. Bram finally spoke, his voice like gravel. "Not strangers, protectors. But we don't work for free, and we don't work by anyone's rules but our own." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Hawk said, pushing off the post. "If we decide someone's a threat, we deal with it, fast. We don't wait for permission, and we sure as hell don't ask it." Prue's gaze held Caleb's, steady and unyielding. "They're the only reason Vane hasn't made his move yet. Word travels fast when these 3 ride in. Men like Vane think twice before crossing them, because the ones who didn't aren't around to tell the tale." Caleb felt the truth in her words, though it sat in his stomach like a stone. He didn't like the idea of giving up control, especially not to men who looked like they'd buried more secrets than most folks live to see. "And if I say no?" Morgan slid his revolver into its holster with a click that felt like a warning. "Then you'd better dig your own grave before Vane does it for you." Hawk's expression softened just a fraction. "We're not here to run your ranch, Mercer. We're here to make sure there's still a ranch left to run." Caleb looked from one hard, weathered face to the next, then to Prue, calm, certain, and waiting for his answer. Outside, the first light of dawn spilled across the fields, touching the land that was his to protect. He exhaled slowly. "All right. But this is my home, my land. You cross a line, you're gone." Hawk smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "Fair enough. Just hope you recognize the line when we're standing on it." The sound woke Caleb before the lantern on the wall had burned halfway down. An unnatural rush of water, a deep groan of timber giving way. He was out of bed and into his boots before the echo faded. By the time he reached the porch, Prue was already saddling her horse, her coat thrown over a thin nightgown, eyes sharp as flint in the moonlight. "It's the dam," she said without looking at him. "And if we ride now, we might catch them." They took the back trail, moving fast but silent. Hawk and Morgan slipping out of the shadows to join them as though summoned by thought alone. The air smelled of wet earth and pine sap, and beneath it all, the metallic tang of trouble. When they reached the ridge overlooking the dam, Caleb saw the damage. A jagged wound in the wooden spillway, water churning out into the fields like a beast loosed from its pen. But Prue's attention wasn't on the water. She was scanning the tree line, her hand resting lightly on the rifle slung across her lap. "They'll circle back," she murmured. "Saboteurs don't risk a night ride unless they know the ground, and this isn't their first time here." She dismounted, signaling Hawk and Morgan to spread out. Bram, a silent shadow, stayed with her, carrying a length of rope. They moved like they'd rehearsed it, choosing their ground. Low brush, a clear shot to the trail, moonlight falling just right. Caleb crouched beside her. "You've done this before." Her eyes flicked to him, unreadable. "I've done what's needed." It was an hour before the first shape emerged from the trees, a hunched figure leading a mule, followed by 2 more men. They kept low, their movements quick and cautious, like foxes stealing from a hen house. One carried a crowbar, the other a bundle of tools still glistening with dam water. Prue didn't give an order, just raised her hand, and the trap closed. Hawk stepped out of the brush with his revolver drawn. Morgan came up from behind, quiet as the wind, cutting off retreat. Bram took the mule's reins before the animal could bray. "Evening, boys," Prue said, her voice cool and steady. "I trust you enjoyed your work. Shame it's the last job you'll ever do for Jasper Vane." The tallest of the 3 spat into the dirt. "You got no proof." Prue tossed a wet glove at his feet. "Found it floating in the spillway, monogrammed. And if that's not enough, I can always let Hawk find out how you squeal under pressure." The men's defiance faltered, and Caleb saw something he hadn't before. A grudging respect in the eyes of the workers who'd followed them from the ranch. They doubted her, whispered behind her back. Now they watched her hold 3 armed saboteurs like she'd been born for it. By the time the culprits were tied and marched back toward the homestead, Caleb knew one thing for certain. Prue Whitlock was not a woman to underestimate. The first changes came quietly, without ceremony. At dawn, Prue stood in the barn with a ledger under one arm, calling each ranch hand by name as she weighed out their rations. No more "take what you need" from the pantry. No more lazy tallies scrawled on scraps of paper. She measured, recorded, and made each man sign for his share. Some muttered about it, but none dared push harder than a few grumbles under their breath. By mid-morning, she was in the storage shed, sleeves rolled up, reorganizing supplies into neat rows, marking barrels with dates, counting every nail and length of rope. When she discovered 2 crates of spoiled grain, half chewed by mice, she didn't curse or wring her hands. She called Caleb over, handed him the ruined grain, and told him to feed it to the hogs. "Waste feeds nothing but the vultures," she said. She rode into town that afternoon with Hawk and Bram flanking her, returning with 2 wagon loads of goods purchased on credit she'd personally negotiated with the storekeeper. Better prices, and a promise of priority deliveries during lean months. By evening, she'd posted a schedule on the barn wall for everything from grazing rotations to supply runs. The men tested her at first, a missing sack of flour here, an unaccounted coil of wire there. Each time Prue called them out in front of the crew, ledger in hand, her voice calm but cutting. It wasn't anger that made them flinch, it was the fact she always had the proof. One by one, the petty thefts stopped. Caleb watched her from the sidelines those first days, expecting her to burn out under the weight of her own rules. But instead, the place began to hum with a new rhythm. The water from the patched dam flowed where it should. Tools were put back where they belonged. Deliveries arrived on time. It was late one evening when Caleb found her in the kitchen, hair loose from its pins, ink smudged on her fingers as she tallied figures by lamplight. "You're wearing them thin," he said. She didn't look up. "No. I'm showing them what the work is worth. Men respect what they earn, and what they fear losing." Caleb leaned against the doorframe, studying her. Somewhere between the day he'd first seen her standing in that ill-fitting wedding dress, and now she had shifted in his mind. She was no longer the woman he'd been forced to marry to save the land. She was the steel rod holding it upright. Outside, the sound of boots crunching in the yard told him the men were still working late, finishing tasks they'd once left undone. And for the first time in years, Caleb felt the weight on his shoulders ease, not because the load was lighter, but because someone else was carrying it beside him. The dust on the horizon came first, a low brown smear against the pale morning sky. Caleb spotted it from the windmill and knew before he counted the riders, Jasper Vane had come to collect what he thought was his. By the time the hoofbeats reached the gate, Hawk, Bram, and Morgan were already in position, rifles angled low but ready. Prue stood in the yard, skirts brushing the dirt, her hands folded as if she were waiting for a guest, not a thief with 6 hired guns at his back. Vane reined in hard, a smirk tugging at his mouth. "I'll make this simple, Mrs. Mercer. You and your husband pack your things. You've had your fun, but this land's mine now." Prue's gaze was steady, almost bored. "You've mistaken stubbornness for weakness, Mr. Vane. I assure you it's not." He laughed, gesturing to his men. 6-3. I like my odds." "That's where you've miscounted," she said softly. At her signal, ranch hands emerged from the barn, rifles and shotguns in hand, faces grim. Men who, a month ago, would have turned tail at the sight of trouble now stood shoulder to shoulder. From the far pasture, 2 wagons rumbled in, neighbors Prue had quietly called on days before, their arrival timed to the minute. Vane's smirk faltered, but he pushed forward. "You're bluffing." "Then test me," Prue replied. The standoff stretched tight, silence settling over the yard except for the creak of leather and the restless shifting of horses. Hawk's rifle never wavered from Vane's chest. Bram had one man square in his sights, Morgan another. Caleb stood just behind Prue, shotgun resting easy in his hands, heart pounding hard enough to feel in his teeth. When Vane finally moved, it wasn't with a charge. It was with a flicker of hesitation, a glance to the right, as if weighing how many of his men would still be breathing after the first volley. Prue didn't give him time to decide. "You'll leave now," she said, her voice carrying in the dry morning air. "And you'll never set foot on Mercer land again. Or you'll stay, and I'll see to it your name is carved on 6 graves before sundown, yours included." The moment cracked. One of his men swore under his breath. Another shifted in the saddle, pulling back on the reins. Vane saw it, the splintering of his own force, and yanked his horse's head around. "This isn't over," he spat. "It is for you," Prue answered. They rode out in a churn of dust, smaller somehow than when they'd come. Caleb let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Around him, the men lowered their weapons, and in their eyes he saw it, the final seal on their loyalty. The Mercer land was safe, for now. But not because of him, because of her. The quiet after the storm felt strange. The men had gone back to their work, the rifles put away, the dust from Vane's retreat settling into the dry earth. Caleb found himself on the porch, leaning against the post, watching Prue oversee the repair of the corral fence as if it were just another day. No hint of the danger they'd faced lingered on her face, only focus, and that steady, unshakable calm that had carried them through every fight. He thought back to the day they'd married, to the bitterness curdling in his gut as he'd stood at the altar, convinced he was being chained to a burden. He had seen her then as a weight hung around his neck, a punishment for his failures and his stepfather's debts. He had expected meekness or perhaps a desperate eagerness to please. Instead, he had met a gaze that looked straight through him, unflinching and sharp, as if she already knew the man he was and the one he could be. Over the weeks, she had stripped away every illusion he'd had about himself, the land and her. She had outthought men who'd spent their lives taken from others. She had turned fear into loyalty among workers who had never respected the Mercer name. She had faced danger without flinching, not because she was reckless, but because she understood that survival was rarely granted. It had to be taken and held with both hands. And somewhere between the arguments and the long nights riding fence together, between the whispered strategies over the kitchen table and the quiet moments when he caught her smiling to herself, something had shifted. He no longer measured her in terms of what she had done for the homestead, but in what she had become to him. The woman who knew every weakness in him and never once used it to wound. The woman who could match his temper and still leave him wanting to be nearer to her when the dust settled. She looked up from the corral now, catching him watching. A faint, knowing smile touched her lips, and he felt it like the pull of the earth itself. "You're staring," she called, amusement in her voice. "Maybe I am," he answered, stepping down from the porch, figuring something out. "Oh?" she asked, one brow arched. "That I was a damn fool to think you were my punishment," he said, his voice low as he reached her. "You're the reason there's still a Mercer name to fight for, and the reason I don't want to fight alone anymore." Her eyes softened, though her smile stayed sly. "Took you long enough to figure that out." "Guess I needed to see you in action," he said, "and I don't plan on looking anywhere else again." For the first time, the homestead didn't feel like a burden. It felt like home, because she was in it. That's the end of the trail, folks. Drop a yes if you're a true Wild West fan. Thanks for riding with me.